Yeah, so thanks so much for having me today. I love the fact that the theme for this conference is making connections, because thinking about the challenges associated with climate change for invasive species and invasive species management, making connections becomes even more important and critical in a changing climate as the species that we're managing are changing, as the techniques that we need to manage them effectively are changing. Being able to know the folks to talk to and have neighbors that we already have connections with that we can call up and ask for advice, that becomes even more critical as sort of the ground and the landscape is shifting under our feet. So I want to talk today about an overview of how climate change and invasive species interact. I am talking as sort of a representative of the leadership team of what we call the Northeast Regional, and that's Northeast US Regional, so it's New England and New York in the Northeast US, Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, or RISC network. If you are interested in more information on sort of the science behind, or just a digest version of the science behind invasive species and climate change, one thing that we do in the RISC network is to synthesize our understanding of different components of these two topics. And so on our website, which is riscnetwork.org, you can download a 2-page synthesis called Double Trouble, which is essentially the digest version of everything that I'm going to talk about today. So here we are with invasive plant management, and as the introduction already articulated, there's plenty of challenges that we're already dealing with invasive species. And now here I am saying, okay, on top of that, let's also consider the effects of climate change. But I want to cast this in sort of in maybe a hopefully more optimistic perspective, which is that invasive species management is already proactive, that you already have the tools to be thinking ahead. You're already thinking about what's coming next. You're thinking about what are new ways to control the species that are here and the species that are coming down the pike. You're thinking about how do we prioritize in terms of our most vulnerable or our most resilient ecosystems and economies. And so adding climate change to this mix makes all of that stuff even more important and potentially more pressing, but you already have the tools to do these things. And so in some ways, we can consider climate change as another opportunity to be proactive. The more you know about climate change, the bigger that opportunity becomes. So another way to think about this is if we know the invasion curve, you know, a lot of times we are dealing with the species that are up here, right? The horse has escaped the barn, and you know the species are all over the place and widespread, and there's not much we can do about it. But in many ways, climate change actually puts us here for a lot of different species. We've got species that are shifting their ranges that have not arrived yet or in the very early stages of arriving. And so we actually have this opportunity for a rare win on the prevention and eradication side of things. So here's an outline of what I'd like to talk about today, which are 4 main ways that climate change and invasive species interact. There are a couple more on that pamphlet, that Double Trouble pamphlet, that I'm not going to cover today, but these are kind of the big 4 in my mind. One is that rising temperatures by themselves favor invasive plants. The second is that climate change causes species to shift their ranges, and so we're going to be dealing with new invasive species coming in. A third is that climate variability creates novel disturbance, and that creates this kind of double whammy effect on native ecosystems, where they're being affected both by climate disturbance and by invasion disturbance. And then lastly, that plant response, invasive plants respond very well to rising CO2, and that creates new challenges for the efficacy of treatment methods. So let's start with number 1, rising temperature favoring invasive species. You guys are going to have to forgive me that being an American, pretty much I don't see beyond the borders, and this is what the world looks like to me. So forgive me that my slides are going to be very US sort of centric, but the same heat waves, the same warming temperatures and longer growing seasons. I guess in Canada, you guys are actually in a normal metric system, so you would have those numbers in Celsius rather than Fahrenheit, but you get the picture. There are lots more warming temperatures, longer growing seasons coming ahead. This is this is one of the few, hopefully, scientific graphs that I'll show you today, because this one is really important in terms of understanding how climate change, different components of climate change, interacts with invasive plants. So this was a meta-analysis from 2017. What a meta-analysis means is that in this study, what they did was, rather than testing, a single plant or a pair of plants in terms of how they perform with elevated temperature, increased precipitation, decreased precipitation, they found all of the different studies in the scientific literature and reanalyzed them to try to figure out, okay, on the whole, on average, what is our expectation of how invasive plants will do under these different conditions, and what is our expectation of how native, non-invasive plants will do under these different conditions. And the one I'm calling your attention to is the one on the top, this elevated temperature. These numbers over here basically mean the number of papers, so the number of studies. So there have been 31 studies that have looked at how non-invasive plants perform under elevated CO2. And on average, they do about the same. So a zero effect size means no change from the ambient temperatures in this case. Positive effect size, where the error bar or the doesn't cross this zero line, a positive effect size says that the performance is significantly better on average for invasive plants under elevated temperature. No significant difference between native and invasives relative to increased precipitation. Actually, a little bit worse performance for invasive plants, potentially, but both native and invasives do worse under drought conditions. So this one at the top, lots of different studies showing that invasive plants do better as we have elevated temperatures. The mechanism behind this, though, is not necessarily clear. So here are some hypotheses as to what might be causing that significantly better performance. And performance could be, in this case, growth rate. It could be the height of the plants. It could be the seed production. There's lots of different things that go in, that have been studied, that went into this meta-analysis. So what might be causing this? One reason might be the idea of what we call priority effects in invasion ecology. And that's the idea that if you're the first out of the gate, or you're the early bird, then you get all of the resources, you get all the worms in that system. Invasive species tend to, or many invasive species tend to be some of the earliest plants that green up within an ecosystem. And as you add temperature, as climate warms, you end up with a longer growing season. So as the growing season gets extended, you could potentially have an even greater priority effect, where your invasive species are greening up, grabbing all those early season resources earlier and earlier, and your natives are lagging farther and farther behind because they are not necessarily responding to those same temperature cues that invasive plants are able to respond to. And these two pictures on the right, so buckthorn, I'm sure, is one that you're well familiar with. Just an example of, an early spring pictures of nice green up in the buckthorn understory with nothing going on yet in the forest canopy. Same thing is true with Japanese barberry, which is a real big problem near where I am in Massachusetts in the Northeast US. Nice green up in the barberry understory, not much going on yet in the native forest canopy. And this is another study that's sort of addressing that same sort of point of whether invasive plants could become more responsive or have become more responsive to this temperature warming. So this is a really cool study, actually, that was done from botanical records in New England. So a lot of these records coming out of the Arnold Arboretum, which is the botanical garden associated with Harvard University in Massachusetts. And what they were able to do is they went back 100 years to the early 1900s, and they looked at, basically in the books of pressed flowers in those herbaria records, the timing of the flowering of those species. And they were able to do this for native species to the greater Boston area, for non-native species but non-invasive species, and also for the subset of those non-natives that were recognized as invasive plants. So what does this graph show? This graph shows that if you look at natives and non-natives, so non-native and non-invasive, not spreading, not having negative impacts, then for the most part, by comparing those two pools, there was no difference in their phenology. So phenology being the timing of biological events, like the timing of plant green-up. Timing of flowering for those species had not changed in 100 years. It was the same for all of those different species. In contrast, if you compared the native versus the invasive species, and remember the native species are basically staying the same, the invasive species had shifted their flowering time earlier in the season by an average of about 11 days. So a week and a half earlier over this 100-year period, the invasive species are shifting, and the best predictor of that was temperature. So this is I think, really good evidence that invasive plants are shifting their growing season earlier in response to temperature, that gives them that advantage in terms of the priority effect, and native species are not typically doing the same thing. So take-home points on that piece in terms of rising temperature favoring invasive plants. That invasive plants tend to have an advantage of emerging earlier when growing seasons are longer. And so if you emerge earlier, you gain that priority effect, you end up outcompeting more easily native species and increasing your impact on ecosystems. Second piece is climate change and range shifts. This is certainly one of the things that comes up again and again when we in the Northeast have talked to our manager partners in the Northeast and across the US, that everybody is really concerned about species, the new species that are coming in, the range shifting invasive species. And so why do we need to be concerned about these range shifting invasive species? Well, the first thing to bear in mind is that climate change is happening really fast, really, really fast. And so I'm in Massachusetts, so I've left a Massachusetts slide on here. And what this graph is trying to illustrate is that in the late 1900s, Massachusetts temperature was, about the same as the geography of Massachusetts. But here we are, and actually I think this slide is now getting to be about 10 years old. So in 2010 or thereabouts, Massachusetts temperatures were more consistent with what had historically been experienced in sort of northern New Jersey. And as we look out to 60 to 80 years ahead, I guess 50 to 80 years ahead, we are dealing with temperatures that are down in the mid-Atlantic to the southeast US. So huge changes in terms of what the future climate looks like. And you can imagine this for wherever you are located within Ontario, that it's going to look very similar. So a species on the east coast of the US would have to move 800 miles over this 100-year time period in order to keep up with the rapid rate of climate warming. So a species needs to move 800 miles in 100 years. So how well are our native species responding and moving in that time period? Not as many studies on this one to try to figure out, the rate of native species movement. We certainly see lots of species responding in this manner, but this one to me is one of the best examples of sort of a rate or measurement of a rate. So this is a study from the Green Mountains. This is in southern Vermont in the US. So in 1964, the Forest Service went out and measured a bunch of transects up the edges of the Green Mountains. And in the middle of those mountain ranges, there's a transition between a northern hardwood forest community and at lower elevations and a boreal forest community at higher elevations. So 40 years later, in 2004, they went back and remeasured those same transects to see whether and how much those two forest communities had shifted in that time period. And what they found was, so consistent with climate change, the northern hardwood communities had expanded upwards in elevation, so into previously too cold for them, but no longer climate space. And the boreal forest had contracted a bit from those lower elevations, again, from that space that used to be cold enough for them, but now is getting too hot. But if you actually measure the amount of movement, on average, these forest communities had moved about 600 feet over 40 years. All right, so 600 feet over 40 years is how much, again, these are trees, like, so we're not expecting them to like pick their skirts up and race up the hill or anything like that, but still, plants are not super fast at dispersing. So this is going to be a reasonable example for how plants are responding. 600 feet in 40 years is how much they're going. 800 miles, I don't know what that is in kilometers, more than that kilometers in 80 years is how much they actually need to go. So orders of magnitude off in terms of whether we can expect sort of native species communities to keep up with climate change. So native species not keeping up generally with climate change. Well, what is keeping up with climate change are our invasive species. On the one hand, it would be lovely if we could just wait for wind and birdies and whatever else to disperse our native species across landscapes, but really the ones that are most advantaged in a warming climate are the things like bamboo, which, is being planted near, like in the Northeast US, at least. It may be coming to Ontario if it's not there already. Are all of these, accidental introductions of species from boats, from equipment that are being moved around, and that those tend to favor the non-native invasive species that we are in effect giving a head start to the species that we don't want to be giving a head start to. The other piece to this is that, and again, I apologize for our inability to see beyond our borders. This largely is because of the data set that we use to construct these models. Several US specific data sets, and that's on us for not doing a better job of going into Canada. But I think if you can sort of imagine the red bullseye in this whole, sort of northeast, northern, north central portion of North America, what this is showing is a projection out to 2050, so not too far away, based on species that we know to be invasive today within the continental US, and those are ones that are either regulated within the US as noxious weeds, or they are ones that are on there's an invasive plant atlas of the US that has a bunch of additional species that folks at Park Service and other agencies have identified. So we identified a total of about 900 species in that modeling effort, and this is all of those species stacked on top of each other to show here's where I'm sitting in Massachusetts, but all of this upper Midwest, Northeast region of North America, or of the US, and, Southern and Southeastern Canada, those are all going to be areas where the invasive species that are currently hanging out down here and causing problems in the, Midwest and Mid-Atlantic US are headed our way, basically. So we in, Southern Canada and the northern states of the US are essentially a hot spot of future plant invasion. So I'm going to highlight a tool that is specific to the US, and I am sorry about that, but this is also a tool that could be quite useful, especially if you happen to be sitting, on the other side of some of these borders. You can create watch lists of sort of specifically what those species are that are going to be shifting into that area. You can do that for these border states, at least in the US, and that should give a pretty good idea of what's going to be happening on your side of the border as well. So if you wanted, if you're close to the state of Michigan, for example, and you create the watch list for Michigan, then that's probably a decent list of species to be concerned about. So Jenica Allen took that modeling effort, so based on this analysis, and worked with the folks from EdMaps, which is out of the University of Georgia, so with funding from the Northeast Integrated Pest Management Center, and got this into a web tool. It is on edmaps.org/range shift listing. So you can go in, you can choose a state, you can choose a scenario. So in this case, I'm looking at a species that is in any state surrounding Pennsylvania, but not yet in Pennsylvania, and is projected to become climatically suitable in Pennsylvania by 2050. And this gives me a list of, I think, 20 or so species for Pennsylvania. So that's a good start. The other piece to this, though, is you don't necessarily need a scientific tool to tell you what species are coming down the pike or you might want to be worried about next. With going back to that theme of the meeting of making connections, the more we're talking to our neighbors, and that means for folks who are on the border, that means trying to make connections not just within Ontario, but potentially. So New York is fantastic in terms of having the New York Invasive Species Research Institute, lots of really good connections to be made there. The Upper Midwest Invasive Species Council, very active. That's just off the screen kind of on this part of the world. Those would be really good connections to be making in terms of finding out what they're dealing with now so that you know what you'll be dealing with tomorrow. Another piece that we've added to this is those lists of range-shifting invasive species tend to be pretty long, especially in this sort of hotspot area of the Northeast US and the Southeast Canada. In our case, for Southern and Northern New England, so all of the New England states, we ended up with about 180 total unique species that are projected to shift into the Northeast by 2050 with climate change. And so one major focus of ours has been to try to narrow down that list. So we have been going through those 180 species and identifying which are the ones that have the highest ecological and socioeconomic impacts, and which are the ones that are most likely to invade ecosystems that actually, forested ecosystems, for example, that actually are a concern in the Northeast. And if you're interested in those analyses, we have now about 180 or so species that we've evaluated that are range shifting into New York and New England. So if you're in sort of the Eastern Ontario area, one of those papers is published, and one of them is submitted at this point. So if you want to take a look at our website or contact me later, I can let you know what those species of concern are for us in the Northeast. So take home point here is that invasive species ranges are shifting, but the silver lining here is that we know what those species are. We have the opportunity to find out what those species are. And so that means we have the chance to potentially get ahead of some of them. Point 3 is this interaction between climate variability and disturbance. So this is a figure from a review of climate disturbance linked to forest die-off in forests across North America. This was actually across the world, but this is the picture for North America. In the Western North America, not just Western US, but Western North America, we often see forest die-off linked to drought. Eastern North America, we see forest die-off not so much tied to drought, but tied to sort of severe winter weather events, so whether that's lots of snow or extreme cold, coupled with really hot summers. And then there's lots of other forms of disturbances that are increasing associated with climate change. So on the Atlantic coast, for example, this is hurricane intensity over a 20-year time period. So based on our best guesses, Atlantic hurricanes are getting stronger, associated with warmer ocean temperatures, warmer air temperatures. Fires are getting larger, associated with warmer temperatures and drier fuels. Flooding events are getting more extreme, associated with peakier precipitation cycles. So more extreme precipitation coupled with more extreme drought. Lots of different things that are affecting native ecosystems. And we know that invasive species thrive with that increase in disturbance. So here's another science graph that I snuck in here of garlic mustard. So garlic mustard is a forest understory invasive herb, biennial herb in the north, all over the place in the Northeast US where I am. If you have just propagular pressure alone, so you add more seeds of this, you get a few more of them. If you have no seeds, I guess, and you disturb a little bit, you get more of them. But if you have lots of seeds and you have disturbance, then you get a huge change in the density of this species. And kudzu is a species that we in Massachusetts are really concerned about. I know there are some populations in New York. I believe there are some populations of kudzu in Ontario as well. This is definitely one of those ones where, we don't want our forests looking like this in the future. And that one appears to respond specifically to warmer temperatures. There, just a couple of years ago, there have been a bunch of news articles out of the state of New Jersey, which is just south of New York, where kudzu has gone from sort of a sleeper species, basically hanging out. We knew about these populations, but it wasn't invading. And, climate change has sort of flipped a switch, and now it is actively expanding from those populations. So climate change and disturbance, take-home point here is that these climate extremes, whether that's extreme heat, extreme drought, extreme flooding events, these things like hurricanes or fire events, those are creating this kind of double whammy effect on native ecosystems. And they also provide an opening for invasive species, knock back the native community and your invasive species are going to thrive. Last piece that I want to talk about is this link between atmospheric CO2 levels, which are rising, that's the underlying cause of climate change, and plant response. I love this graph because it's just so cool looking at these little, I think the sawtooth pattern on here is just fascinating. So if you haven't heard this before, the reason behind this, so this is what's referred to as the Keeling curve. So an atmospheric chemist by the name of, I believe, Charles Keeling in the late 1950s put some sensors for atmospheric chemistry at the top of Mauna Loa Observatory. This is on the Big Island of Hawaii, so in the middle of the Pacific. The idea being this is pretty far away from major human infrastructure or cities or something like that. So we're probably getting a decent estimation of what the overall atmosphere is doing, and we're not going to be influenced by like the city of Los Angeles or something like that. So the black line is the trend in CO2 over that time period. When this started in the late 1950s, we were below 320. We are well over 400 today. If you use other measurements to kind of track back in history, the estimate is that pre-industrial, before the Industrial Revolution, we were probably closer to 280 parts per million. So this is a pretty major change, and we're seeing the effects of it. The sawtooth on here is essentially the Northern Hemisphere plants sucking in CO2 during the springtime and then no longer sucking in CO2 during the wintertime. And the reason you end up with this sawtooth is because much of the Northern Hemisphere is terrestrial. Well, I don't know if much, but there's a lot more land mass in the Northern Hemisphere on Earth than there is in the Southern Hemisphere on Earth. And so all those plants, all your Canadian boreal forests, in the start of spring, start pulling in all of this CO2 to photosynthesize, and they pull down the global average of how much CO2 there is in the atmosphere. Where we are right now, sort of in the middle of winter, is on the steep upswing side of things because our forests are waiting for spring to arrive. Okay, a little digression. The main point here is that photosynthesis, if you guys remember from ninth grade biology, or and probably more recent biology than that, photosynthesis requires water, it requires carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it requires light. And so adding CO2 to the atmosphere is essentially a fertilizer for plants. And so plants, on average, do better with higher CO2. So they increase their growth, trees, crops, shrubs, herbaceous species. They tend to have more flowers, they have more fruits, they have larger seed mass. But these average numbers of better growth, better productivity sort of belie a large variation in how any individual plant is going to do. And I always put this figure up at the bottom. This is actually from a website that ExxonMobil, so the oil company, sponsored maybe like 15 or 20 years ago, and it was up for a long time. It might still be out there, where they were trying to say that CO2 emissions were green because look at how much faster this pine tree or whatever that is grows when you end up with more and more CO2 in the atmosphere. So again, just sort of that crazy and evolving history of how we see science through the lens of corporate advertising. All right, key point here. Different species, different types of species have a variation in how they perform as you add this fertilizer, CO2 fertilizer. And this is that same meta-analysis that we looked at the beginning with the temperatures. And now I'm adding the CO2 bar on here. So what you can see is the blue one, which is the native species. They are to the right of the zero line. So on average, native species perform better. They have faster growth, they have more seeds, what have you, with elevated CO2. But you can see that the invasive bar, the red one on here, the invasives do even better, super significant in terms of relative to a baseline, but also significantly better than the native species are performing. And so why might this be? Again, the mechanism isn't super clear, but a good hypothesis would be that weedier species, because they are resource hogs, basically they want to take all those resources so that they can grow really fast. Our weedier invasive species use more resources. If you give them more resources, they're going to compete even better and more effectively against the native ecosystems, especially if those native ecosystems have evolved under lower resources, that they're not as evolved to grow bigger, faster, stronger as soon as you add some fertilizer. And the other piece that's really important here is not only do we have invasive species performing better, but we are also seeing that invasive species are becoming harder to kill as you add CO2 to the atmosphere. So this was a study done on Canada thistle in the early 2000s. They repeated the study on another 5 or so species and found kind of similar results for those. What you're seeing is ambient as of 2004 CO2, elevated CO2 conditions. And both of these two plots, and these are like right next to each other, had the same amount, whatever the recommended amount of glyphosate applied to them. Under ambient CO2, that glyphosate was pretty effective in terms of killing most of that Canada thistle. With more CO2, not effective at all in terms of killing the Canada thistle. And the reason why is because for this particular species, what happened was Canada thistle with elevated CO2 put a lot of growth below ground, so had larger roots, made it much easier to resprout and harder generally to kill. All right, so take home point is that all plants are doing better with higher CO2, but that those relative improvements really matter. And so if your invasive species are getting just even a little, but in many cases a lot of advantage, that makes them even more of a problem. All right, so a couple of final slides of sort of what do we do about it? So I showed you at the beginning that 2-page synthesis that we put together at the Northeast Risk Network on, the first one was on double trouble, which is interactions between invasive species and climate change. We have also put together a synthesis called Taking Action, which is essentially ideas for climate smart invasive species management, also available at the risknetwork.org. All of these ideas came from managers. So we had a meeting at the North American Invasive Species Management Association annual meeting in 2019. We asked, what are your ideas for climate smart invasive species management? And then we put all of those ideas together. So the more we can share ideas and solutions, again, those making connections, the better off we are going to be in terms of finding good solutions. So here's just 3 more slides. I'll be done. Just a couple of examples of taking action. So a problem, invasive plants are emerging earlier and are becoming more competitive. Well, what kinds of things do we need to think about? Well, some examples would be, making sure that you've got, pretty responsive management to the early growing season, that you're keeping an eye on the ground for as soon as things are coming out. That we need to be testing management techniques, and especially testing management techniques, across climate gradients for similar species to see, like, is this management technique, is it going to work as well as the recommended amount of herbicide, or, whatever other action we're doing, is that going to continue to work well as climate is warming? In terms of this climate change creating this novel disturbance, or the double whammy on native ecosystems, well, this requires a lot more thinking ahead and prioritization in terms of strategic planning. So what are the areas that have the potential to be most vulnerable to this combined effects of climate change and invasion? Do we have areas that are vulnerable to, high amounts of erosion that would be highly susceptible if there was a long-term drought or a flood? Those are the types of places where if those are critical ecosystems that we want to protect, then reducing invasions in those areas and looking for invasive species after major disturbances becomes all the more pressing. And then the last piece is are these range shifting species? So invasive species are shifting. What do we need to do? Some of this is that making connections, talking to neighbors, looking for lists that other people are managing and how they're managing it. But a good chunk of this is also on the policy side. So pushing for and enforcing current invasive species policies that would, at least in the US, more than half of our invasive plants were deliberately introduced as ornamentals. So can we stop introducing the ornamentals that we know to be invasive a little bit further south? That would be a huge win as far as proactive management and policy. So if you're interested in this topic on invasive species and climate change, we have, through the Northeast Risk Network, we have a listserv, which you can join if you go to risknetwork.org. Although Northeast is in our name, we push out information that I think is relevant at a much broader scale, and hopefully making those connections to us and making connections to more invasive species managers in the US is ultimately helpful in terms of figuring out what's coming next and what we do about it. So thanks so much for your time, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and happy to look at some of the questions. I don't know what the first, this is me as a like silly academic. I don't even know what the first question means. So I think you'll have to like, I think you'll have to say again, the CFC12 and CH4, maybe those are different herbicides, I'm guessing. I'm going to try to go through the questions. I'm happy to talk more about building climate change into your invasive species planning. That's actually something that we're trying to work on right now in the US of like where, like what are the policy mechanisms? Another thing that we've been thinking a lot about in the US is certainly wherever we're at in the US right now in terms of politics, but our hope is that, that with the incoming Biden administration, because they are very focused on climate change and climate adaptation and mitigation, that part of what we need to be thinking about is making sure that invasive species get into new policies focused on climate change, so that that's part of what people are thinking about moving forward. And, you know, we're also hopeful that maybe that'll, sounds like you guys had a real problem with losing funding, that maybe, maybe through climate change, we can get some more support for invasive species action as well. The cheat sheets, if you go to risknetwork.org, or if you just Google RISCC, I think you should find our website, and there is a tab on there called resources, or hopefully something obvious, that has all of those management challenges in it. What invasive species am I most concerned about and why? And things keep moving. And are there any that are showing up in the US that haven't been seen in Canada yet? I don't know about the second half. In terms of invasive species that we're most concerned about, so kudzu is definitely one that we're worried about. There are small populations, like I said, in New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, that have not yet, that are established but not invasive, basically. And we are looking at those established but not invasive populations as the potential ground zero for the next kudzu invasions, basically. We are also, in terms of southern New England versus northern New England, I saw that there's a talk later today on Japanese stiltgrass, on microstegium. That's definitely one that is high on the list, and that goes all the way down to the southeast US. So one thing that we've done in the Northeast with the Risk Network is to try to put together panels of scientists and managers for a couple of specific species. We did that a year and a half ago or thereabouts for Japanese stiltgrass. Another one that we looked at was mile a minute vine, also one that's expanding from southern New England to northern New England. There's lots of there's lots of species that we can all be worried about. So there's a question about soil effects for range shifting species, and I unfortunately do not know anything about the soil effects, but I think that's a great question. And one thing that we need more of is your continued input on what the most important science questions are. You know, I come from the science side. Being part of the Risk Network for the last 5 years or thereabouts is sort of my first real exposure to what managers actually need. You know, we know that there's a big gap in our conversations, but the more we can push manager needs basically up to the science communities and the scientific funding agencies, the more chance we have to continue to fund things that are important. And I know that I'm getting kind of towards the end of my time. So maybe I'll just continue down the questions until somebody interrupts me. In terms of woody vines responding to CO2, Yeah, that's interesting, actually. So some of the grapevines are ones that show up as those, I mean, these are the native grapevines, but there's actually, non-native wine grapes show up on the list of range shifting, potentially invasive species. It would not surprise me at all if vines are responding to CO2. In fact, one of the classic studies of CO2 with species response was actually for poison ivy down in North Carolina, so in the southeast US. So this is at a long-term ecological research station, which is one of the ones, and at this particular area, they had an experiment where they were actually like blasting the forest with CO2 to try to see what happens under elevated CO2. And one of the first things that they noticed was, gosh, there's a heck of a lot more poison ivy in this plot. So then, of course, they sent a grad student out to to survey all the poison ivy, and she did determine that there was quite a bit more, and that it was also more. It was producing more of the toxins, whatever it is. So pretty crazy.
Well, this has been can everyone hear? Am I okay? This has been a great and really informative presentation today, Dr. Bradley. I want to thank you so very much. I see there's still questions coming in here, and if possible, we hope that you'll stick around and answer them either in the chat directly, or that be available later in the day and people can contact you and come sit with you and have a chat. Really thought-provoking and helping us understand the impact of climate change and global warming on invasive plants, and linking the changes to the environment to this impact on invasives, but also on native plants. That was my big takeaway, emphasizing as well the need for connections to help find solutions and how we have to all work together. And I think that, again, thank you for tying your presentation into our theme, but I think that is a part that's so difficult to quantify. It's the value of those connections that make the action and create the change. So we greatly appreciate your time today. We thank you for coming to speak with us. And if everyone can give a round of applause. Thank you very much, Dr. Bradley.